Greetings. So here we are again. The best time of year. The spooky time of year. The time of year where blood-curdling tales of misfortune are consumed across all entertainment mediums. Movies, TV, books, and of course, video games. Regardless of the medium, horror has always been a genre that perhaps more than any other can deliver such a wide range of experiences. Let's take movies for example. In the world of film, there's almost an infinite number of horror subgenres. There's horror-themed comedies, classic subtext-driven horror, slow cerebral horror, science fiction horror, schlocky action horror, horror based on family drama. The list goes on and on. Now, when it comes to video games, there's arguably even more room for the creation of new subgenres, given the length of the experiences, which can allow for tones and genres to shift more easily than in a movie, and the nature of the player's participation, which can also allow for a large variety of tonal experiences in just a single title. A great example of this that I was replaying recently was Metal Gear Solid 5, The Phantom Pain. Now, while this game is by all intents and purposes an open-world stealth action game with crafting and base building elements, there are many sequences and moments in its lengthy runtime where it takes a hard turn into straight-up horror, something that is especially prevalent in the game's opening. Trust me, play the opening mission and tell me that's not out-and-out horror. Go on, do it. I dare you, go on. Fucking do it. So, with so many different flavours of horror, it can be hard for new entries in the genre to stand out, especially if they're mid-budgeted and from a smaller studio. But like all the scariest things that go bump in the night, some games survive and catch you off guard when you least expect it. Some games stalk your attention, hiding amongst your backlog, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And when they do, you better be ready to actually quite enjoy yourself. Vampyr. I think it's Vampire. I'm going to say Vampire. Is a dialogue-driven, gothic action horror RPG developed by French developer DontNod and published by Focus Home Interactive. Founded in 2008, DontNod were initially known for the sci-fi action-adventure game Remember Me. Set in a dystopian, cyberpunk-esque Paris in the year 2084, Remember Me channeled themes of capitalist greed, the corporate control of society, and the rise of social media as a means of exploitation. Eventually releasing in 2013, Remember Me would actually start life as a Sony exclusive. However, Sony would cancel the project in February of 2011, a move that was reportedly instigated by the project's budget being cut after what had been a turbulent development, leading to the relationship between DontNod and Sony to sour. After pitching the now slightly altered, almost finished Remember Me at a Gamescom trade fair, DontNod were eventually able to secure Capcom as a publisher, and the finished product released 2 years later in 2013. However, despite a loyal fanbase who continued to sing the game's praises to this day, Remember Me would garner mixed reception from critics and would also fail to meet its sales expectations. This would almost spell the end of DontNod, with the studio entering judicial reorganization in 2013 and almost going under completely, before they were even able to put their next project into production. However, thanks to help from French agency funding and also a publishing deal with Square Enix, DontNod would recover and get to work on what would end up being their most popular game to date, Life is Strange. Life is Strange would begin development in April of 2013 with a small team of just 15 people. While this number would grow once Square Enix signed on as publisher and began lending their own resources to the project, proceedings would still remain modest during the game's development, with the studio opting for an episodic approach, a format that, despite having fallen out of favour in recent years, was very popular for a while with smaller, story-driven indie titles. This was thanks in no small part to the success of Telltale games at the time. Much like Telltale's popular titles, Life is Strange is an episodic, story-driven adventure game with branching narratives and light puzzle elements. Set in Oregon, Life is Strange tells the story of Max Caulfield, an 18-year-old photography student who, after experiencing a grim vision of a seemingly incoming catastrophe, discovers she has the ability to rewind time. However, despite forming the basis for many of the game's mechanics and acting as the main narrative thrust for the story, Max's abilities are not the main focus, with the relationships she develops and formative troubles she experiences acting more as the game's central themes. Upon its release, Life is Strange would achieve huge financial and critical success, spawning several sequels and allowing DontNod the financial freedom to begin developing other ideas for its next project. Starting development shortly after Life is Strange, Vampyr would see a much larger team assigned, with the initial number of developers being around 60. This number would reportedly grow to almost 80 in the project's later stages, making it one of DontNod's largest and most ambitious projects to date. Beginning as a concept that would take place in 1950s America, the team decided after a period of pre-production that a more gothic setting would be in order, settling on 1918 London at the height of the Spanish flu epidemic. According to DontNod, much of the game's tone was inspired by painters like Phil Hale, and documentaries and books focused on London's architecture and population during the period, such as Liquid History, The Thames Through Time, were also heavily consulted. Also, as many of the game's elements and characters revolve around the study and application of medicine during this period, the BBC show Casualty 1900s was also used as a primary resource in order to try and accurately depict hospital practices and medical treatments of the era. As development progressed and work on Life is Strange wrapped up, more members of that team would move over to Vampyr, no doubt contributing to the final product's narrative and dialogue-driven focus, a key feature of DontNod's previous game. After almost 5 years in development, Vampyr would launch on the 5th of June 2018 for PlayStation 4, Xbox One and PC, with a Switch port coming almost a year and a half later on the 29th of October 2019. Despite receiving mixed reviews from critics, the title would succeed commercially, selling over 1 million copies by April of 2019. So that's the story of how Vampyr came to be, but what about the tale it tells? Our story begins on a cold and foggy night in the deserted streets of post-Victorian London. Dr. Jonathan Reed, a celebrated and well-renowned physician and academic, awakens with a start in a mass grave filled with unfamiliar corpses piled high on the city's docks. You know, as you do on a Friday night. No stranger to being surrounded by death given his recent exit from the front lines of the Great War, where he served as a medic, Reed attempts to take stock of his surroundings, but is seemingly afflicted by an oppressive and unfamiliar trance-like state. After getting to his feet with what little energy and resolve he still possesses, the Doctor begins to try and get his bearings and overcome this newfound state of being. But he soon realises that it is in fact a weakness predicated by some kind of unfamiliar thirst. Continuing to stumble through this newfound hellscape, he eventually happens across a figure who is seemingly exclaiming something to him in a heightened state of emotion. Blinded by this newfound thirst, however, Reed only sees this figure as a font of nectar that his survival demands. And so, with little forethought, as he is embraced by this mysterious character, he is overcome with a newfound craving and plunges his newly developed fangs into her artery, draining her of her blood and her life, and regaining his focus and resolve in the process. You know, as you do on a Friday night. But such elation is short-lived, as looking down through his newly cleared vision, what he sees laying lifeless at his feet is an all too familiar figure, his own sister, Mary. It seems Mary had been looking for him amongst the sea of death and decay, when he was presumed dead after going missing sometime after returning to London from the front. After struggling to come to terms with his new vampiric form, what he's done in the last few moments, and even attempting to take his own life, Reed begins to follow a trail that takes him all over Whitechapel, into the employ of a struggling hospital, and across many other dark and sinister locations across London, in search of whomever or whatever did this to him, and their reasons for committing such a heinous act. But as Reed searches for answers, he also happens across many a potential ally or victim, depending on how much he chooses to embrace this new form. You see, while we'll talk more about the systems in play here in a little bit, the type of vampire Reed ends up being, the fate of the city he calls home, and even the end of this tale, are all determined by the player's actions throughout the 15 to 20 hour long story. While Reed himself and many parts of his tale are set in stone, and while the player agency on show here is by no means groundbreaking, the decisions you make and how they play into the game's other systems end up being a large part of Vampyr's appeal when all is said and done, especially when it comes to the storytelling and how the story plays out. But again, we're getting ahead of ourselves. Now, this is a spoiler-free review, so I'll be mainly using footage from the game's first few hours, and I definitely don't want to spoil any specifics. But what I can say is that the writing here is good, if occasionally inconsistent, and even sometimes kinda cringe. It's clear that the atmosphere was a key focus in the game's development, and in order to evoke tones seen in popular vampire and horror fiction, much of the game's dialogue feels decidedly Victorian in tone. Now, while this does feel in keeping with the game's setting and tone, especially given the fact that it only takes place less than 2 decades after the Victorian period had ended, the writers sometimes miss the target. While this doesn't happen too often, when it does, the results are hilarious at best and cringingly pretentious at worst.
What is darkness but lurking sun? What is wall but enslaved stone? What is glass but tortured sand? What is song but a call to arms?
Now, let me reiterate, this is not a common occurrence. And it's also worth remembering that large amounts of the game's dialogue were actually initially written in French and then translated, which could have given rise to the odd weird choice here and there, or sentence that sounds overtly pretentious or convoluted. For the most part though, the writing in Vampyr is one of its strongest qualities. The story is interesting and touches on many key themes like PTSD, pressure on medical institutions, the history of London, the concept of the academic in a post-World War I era, and many, many more, all of which are handled with grace and subtlety. Also, real talk for a second, a game that takes place in the midst of a deadly outbreak of an unknown disease just hits differently in 2022. You know what I mean? Its setting is decidedly gothic and well realised, its characters feel realistic and largely avoid caricatures, and its focus on choice and consequence leans into the studio's strengths, with a clear skill set developed and honed through the development of Life is Strange being used to great effect here. It also boasts multiple endings which can add replay value, and are, perhaps most importantly, not simply based on a binary or arbitrary choice made in the game's final act. Instead, these vary based on many smaller choices made throughout the game. But it's how these story elements bleed into... Did you get it? Bleed. Blood. The vampire. But it's how these story elements bleed into the game's systems that really impresses here, and also serve to show the interesting and highly ambitious approach DontNod took when making this game. So let's start with those conversations. There aren't a lot of people populating the streets of London in Vampyr, mainly due to the aforementioned ongoing Spanish flu epidemic and the fact that Reed's new disposition forces him to only stalk the streets at night. But of the few that are around, many of them can be spoken to, have fully fledged personalities, character profiles, routines, friends, health, and perhaps most importantly, an XP meter. They also have a mesmerise value, but we'll come back to that in just a second. Whenever you talk to an NPC, you'll learn more about the main quest, a side quest, the area you're in, or any other characters they may speak to regularly, interact with, or know about. This manifests in-game as hints, and learning a new one about someone will allow for new conversation options to open up, increase your social standing with them, sometimes help to find side quests, and also learn more about what mental and physical state they might be in. Even more information on the NPCs can be found in the game's Citizen menu, which will not only show any hints you've unlocked about them, it will also show all the aforementioned information, as well as the character in question's social circle, often giving an indication as to who might be best to speak to in order to learn even more about them. Now, let's talk about their health bar for a second. Essentially, NPCs in Vampyr can be suffering from several conditions which will slowly make them iller over time. This will in turn change their behaviour and also has an effect on the district in which they reside. Districts have their own individual condition rating based on the health and happiness of the NPCs who reside there. If everyone is healthy, happy, and any outstanding favours they need completing are done, then the district will have a higher rating. However, if its occupants are unhealthy, unhappy, scared or injured, the district rating will go down, eventually leading it to be unsavable, and all those in it to be doomed one way or another. Unsurprisingly, this is the main factor which dictates the ending you'll get and how things will all play out. But this is really just scratching the surface, as when it comes to keeping everyone in good spirits and even better health in Vampyr, there's even more depth and nuance to proceedings. So, utilising the aforementioned game menus and his Vampyr vision, Reed is able to ascertain the condition of NPCs, as well as check the other information mentioned before, once he has spoken to them and the necessary introductions have been made. Essentially, you have to speak to most characters at least once before you can start learning stuff about them. Reed is also able to be told certain info by other members of the NPC in question's social circle, such as their name or where they might be from, etc. So, related to all of this is the game's crafting system. Essentially, materials can be found as you travel around London, or defeat foes, and these can be used to either craft beneficial items, like tonics that replenish health, upgrades for your weapons, which come in either ranged or close combat forms, or medicine to help cure the aforementioned ailments of each district's population. What this means is, you might have the materials to either craft an upgrade for your machete, or medicine that will heal a patient at the hospital, but not both. Moreover, that medicine might also be required for a side quest to keep an NPC alive, so they can give you more information, or more quests later in the game. Now, I think I know what you might be thinking. What if I embrace the darkness? What if I don't give a shit about these people, and I'm happy to let London fall to ruin as I embrace my new life as this superior being? Well, you are of course free to make that decision, but it might not be the orgy-ridden hellscape party time that you're imagining. Firstly, when areas fall into anarchy, they become much more dangerous and hostile. Second, you may miss out on certain content if an NPC dies too early. But perhaps most interestingly of all, the NPCs in Vampyr will provide more XP for Reed if he is to feed on them, the happier and healthier they are. This is so fucking brilliant because it actually serves to accurately impose a genuine vampiric dilemma on the player. Should you just kill everyone and feed on them now for quick XP boosts? But then, if you were nice to them for a while, they'd learn to trust you and provide even more XP, meaning you'll reap the benefits and rewards, and also have an easier time luring them to their demise. Hell, on my first playthrough, I decided to play as virtuous as possible and never feed on any of my colleagues, or any of the NPCs in any other districts. But as I completed more and more side quests and they came to trust me, their wonderful, attentive doctor who cured them of their ailments, I saw those potential XP numbers literally rise higher and higher, and soon temptation began to creep in. Also, the fact that I was playing like this in the first playthrough made me a less powerful vampire as I was feeding less, which makes perfect sense. So I had that constant feeling that I was a little underleveled, and just feeding on one of these idiots could help me increase my power and gain the upper hand. After all, no one would miss just one of them, surely. But you see, it's a slippery slope, and that one XP injection can so easily become 2 or 3 or 10 or 20, and before you know it, London's streets are running red with the blood of your victims, and you've become what you always despised, a dark reflection of the doctor that started this journey. Someone who takes life instead of giving it. All of this presents the player with a choice. Will you be the best doctor London has ever seen, or will you be England's worst physician since Dr. Harold Shipman? If you decide to make one of your trusted allies your latest victim, Reed also has the ability to mesmerize any human, providing his mesmerize level is high enough. This is the indicator I mentioned earlier, and it's also something that varies depending on how trusting the NPC in question is. Reed can also buff this ability through leveling up and certain skill unlocks. If you do mesmerize someone, Reed is able to lead them somewhere much quieter, without resistance, where he won't be disturbed. A nice touch that, while admittedly isn't quite as developed as it could be, nonetheless adds another wrinkle to proceedings. If you take all of these elements together, what is created is one of the best vampire simulators ever made, at least in the social sense. Of all the games based on or around this subject matter, Vampyr probably manages to recreate that well-established, fictional moral push and pull better than any other, and it does it by utilising incredibly well-designed and deep interlocking systems that dovetail effortlessly into one another. While there is a lot to like about this game, this is by far its best feature for me, and is probably worth the price of admission alone if you enjoy dialogue-driven games, vampire fiction, or both. But while it succeeds perhaps more than any other example in its subgenre when it comes to this part of the game, there are areas of the gameplay and design that unfortunately fall much, much shorter. Chief among these are probably the game's movement and combat. So from the off, movement in Vampyr feels a little sluggish and unresponsive. While not the worst I've ever played by any stretch, as you walk around the city and explore the game's districts, things often feel more than a little janky, with plenty of collision issues and unresponsive input delays to keep you mildly uncomfortable with how Reed moves. While I know this game's segmented districts keep it from being a full traditional open world, the fact is that even in the game's largest areas, you never really feel like you can move around them and explore them like a vampire. A really good example of this is the way Reed uses his teleport dash ability. So normally in games with large areas to explore, when you're playing as a supernatural or overly powered individual, you're able to freely move around in ways that other mere mortals cannot. But in Vampyr, despite playing as a legendary monster known for its speed, mobility and guile, you're only really able to jog around linear paths and enter a few buildings, and crucially, only use this teleport ability in predetermined locations. This means that you can't whiz up to the top of the highest building like some sort of juiced up post-Victorian Batman. Instead, all you can do is zip over to that boat over there if the icon shows up. And if it doesn't show up, tough titties. Now, I know it's probably unfair to compare this game to something like Spider-Man. After all, that game came out much later, clearly had a much larger budget, and also is a true open world. But even by its own standards, the movement and exploration in Vampyr just feels very limited, and that's a shame because the atmosphere is genuinely great in a lot of these areas. However, all of these jankier elements are unfortunately only exacerbated when you're tasked with taking on any of the game's enemies. Right from the game's opening few minutes, it's clear that combat is going to be much jankier than you might hope. Both enemies and Reed feel floaty and lack weight. The AI does weird stuff and gets caught on the environment, and impact is lacking whether it's giving or receiving hits. When fighting, you have close quarters weapons like a machete and ranged weapons like a pistol. These can also be switched with the directional buttons if you have more than one equipped, similar to the way it works in FromSoft games like Dark Souls and Bloodborne. Enemies have a health bar and a stun meter. If their stun meter is depleted, which is usually done with specific attacks or with successful parries, they can be fed on, which allows Reed to absorb some of their health and also charge his own blood abilities up. These abilities can then be unleashed on enemies or used to buff Reed. The aforementioned XP you gain throughout the game, through side quests, sacrificing NPCs, and in general combat, unlock new abilities and passives, increase Reed's stats like his health or attack power, and even buff his crafting ability by gaining more materials or having certain items cost less to produce. However, this can only be done when resting at one of the game's many safe room areas. As expected when in combat, there are other standard features that can be employed, such as a dodge to move you out of danger and a lock-on to focus on single targets, etc. These systems in and of themselves are perfectly fine, and in fact some of them are super interesting, but the problem here isn't how the game works, it's how it feels to play. I know it's a tired comparison at this point, and I already made it once, but when I first saw clips of Vampyr's combat gameplay in the lead up to the game's release, it looked like it was going to be channeling Bloodborne. And while I never thought it would be as impressive as that masterpiece, even looking at the footage of it now, you can probably see what I mean. Beyond the gothic imagery, the use of lock-on combat and a pistol just evoked that vibe, and so I was hoping for at least a decent imitation if nothing else. But unfortunately, Vampyr, for me at least, doesn't even come close to achieving the kind of combat prowess seen in any From Software title from the past decade and change. And while it's very clear that the explosion of the Souls series and the Souls-like genre served as a chief inspiration for the game's combat system here, within only a few seconds of taking control of Reed, I was like, this doesn't feel great. In fact, it feels kind of bad. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not the worst combat ever, and some fights were genuinely fun, particularly boss battles, which singular nature often made things feel much better, given that multiple foes only serves to complicate how these combat systems interact with each other. Also, I have heard many others who got on with the combat system much better than I did. And it is true that the more you play Vampyr and the more abilities you unlock for Reed, the more fun taking down foes does become. It's just a shame that if you do remain less powerful due to your exploits as London's saviour, you'll probably have a much worse time when it comes to fighting stuff. All in all though, Vampyr stumbles when it comes to its combat and more action-heavy gameplay sections, which are for the most part pretty janky and unsatisfying. So gameplay and design are a bit of a mixed bag here, but with highs high enough to carry you through the lows for sure. But what about the presentation? Well, once again, there's good and bad to talk about. So let's start with the bad, as it's kind of related to what we were just talking about. Essentially, some of the animation work in Vampyr is a little inconsistent, with some movements and attacks looking really fluid and others looking a lot more budget. A lot of them kind of have a marionette quality, like they're not quite brimming with the necessary amount of life. On top of this, certain animations seem to have been omitted entirely. I mean, look what happens when I open a crate or box. I mean, it doesn't even animate open. It just switches from a still closed asset to an open one. Also, some of the character designs are kind of artistically inconsistent, with many characters looking much more lifelike and others going for a stylized approach. While both of these are fine, they can occasionally just be a little incongruous, especially when Reed himself looks like the most stylized of the bunch. Moreover, those janky animations are also prevalent in most of the game, regardless of what you're doing, and so exploration, combat, and cutscenes can occasionally be a little distracting when a weird-looking movement or action pops up. The cutscenes are presented as either in-game affairs, or sometimes as these 2D pre-rendered FMVs. While both are perfectly serviceable, barring some hokey dialogue and the aforementioned odd animation here and there, the aim of these is rarely to convey much action, and they're usually utilised for exposition dumps or to set the scene, both of which they accomplish with little issue most of the time. However, there are 3 elements within Vampyr's presentation that truly elevate it from its competition, and also serve to create a truly foreboding, oppressive, and deliciously gothic atmosphere. These are its art design, particularly regarding its environments, its music, and its voice acting. So let's talk about the areas first. While their actual layout and anything that relates to game design are only perfectly serviceable, if even a little generic, the way they're dressed, lit, and decorated is truly fantastic. From an artistic perspective, these elements are some of the most important when it comes to the atmosphere in this game, and special commendation should go to the environment artists, lighting artists, and VFX teams here. While the game as a whole looks kinda budget, it still manages to create such a lived-in feeling when it comes to its world and locations, and this is in no small part due to the work done in these areas. Second, we have the music, which also does a great job at creating mood. While its focus on ambience over melody means that there aren't many catchy tracks that stick in your head, its use of background sounds and noise composition, coupled with constantly shifting music, allows it to create a great backdrop to almost any scene or area. Lastly, we have the voice acting, which is another standout here. While some characters can lay it on a little bit thick, the majority give great performances with just the right amount of mood and gravitas. This is especially true when it comes to Anthony Howell's performance as Reed, which manages to balance the calm academic resolve of a lifelong physician with the sinister and murderous potential of a newly born vampire perfectly. All in all then, when it comes to presentation, what we have here is a budget AA title elevated by some standout performances, music, and art direction. It's not the most beautiful game you'll ever see, and don't expect From Software levels of expertise when it comes to blending the awe-inspiring and the horrific. But much like the rest of the game, the lofty ambitions of the developers serves to move Vampyr above the average run-of-the-mill competition in the AA space. But enough about how this game looks and plays, let's talk about the replay value, the game length, and any bugs. In terms of the first two, Vampyr will usually run you around 15 to 20 hours, depending on how much you want to interact with the district's inhabitants and how many of them you plan to save. However, having said this, the fact that Vampyr presents such choices to the player, coupled with the fact that it has 4 different endings, adds more than a little replay value. On top of this, DontNod added a New Game Plus mode post-launch along with some more difficulty options, which gives even more reasons to go back and give these dark and moody streets another visit. Personally, I played through the game twice and then save scummed for the other endings and trophies, and that was perfect for me, but your mileage may vary. Either way, its common inclusion in sales and this video's distance from the game's original release date should allow you to be able to pick up Vampyr super cheap, and with that in mind, I would say there's more than enough value for money here. Regarding bugs, I wouldn't say there's anything too serious nowadays, with most of the issues having been squashed with multiple post-launch updates. Sure, there's the odd bit of jank here and there, the aforementioned occasional animation glitches, and I also had one mission not trigger its next phase, which was annoying, but luckily reloading a recent save fixed this issue. However, having said this, I have been cautioned by some that the Xbox version can present more problems in this regard, and has even had to be limited to a single save file slot instead of the 3 slots seen in other versions, to allow for extra autosave backups in case of crashes and corruption. Now, I played this game mainly on PlayStation 4 and got the Platinum Trophy, and then I put a bunch of time into the PC version, which is the footage you've been seeing in this review. So, with that in mind, I can't really comment on the current state of the Xbox version in 2022. Maybe check out some other videos or forums if that's your platform of choice. Or, if you are aware of what it's like nowadays, maybe hit up the comments section down below and let us know what the deal is. And like and subscribe. Also, as an aside to this, I must say that the PC version is by far my recommended platform if you have the means. It's pretty cheap on Steam in the sales, it runs at a smooth 60 FPS on most systems nowadays, it has full Steam Deck verification and runs great there too, and I saw no compatibility issues at all, barring weird tearing when lights flicker that disappeared completely after I turned VSync off. Finally, I know that Vampyr also saw a Nintendo Switch release about a year and a half after its initial launch on other platforms, but unfortunately, I have no idea how this version runs. Again, let us know in the comments below if you have any knowledge or experience of that version. Like and subscribe. And so, in this hallowed season of ghosts, ghouls and goblins, of creatures most horrid and all manner of horrors awaiting you, is Vampyr a suitably spooky way to spend your time? For me at least, the answer is yes. Like many of the best AA games, its lofty ambitions serve to elevate it above many of its peers and create a memorable and interesting experience that oozes atmosphere. While it is admittedly more than a little janky and has some significant issues, none of this is enough to ruin what remains a worthwhile experience, in my opinion at least. But while these elements could have seen more polish or have been approached with more expertise, it's worth remembering that Vampyr represented a change in genre for its developer. And while DontNod also managed to incorporate its signature text-based gameplay elements that had put them on the map a few years earlier with Life is Strange, Vampyr is still a very different beast. I would say without any hesitation that all of its systems and disparate parts, even those that don't work, contain great ideas, just with varying levels of success when it comes to their execution. With this in mind, I think what this game really needs more than anything else is a sequel. A chance to keep the good and improve on the bad, because despite its flaws, there's something really special here. A kernel of a franchise that could develop into something truly spectacular and garner even more success. While I know no such follow-up has been announced, and while I also know that such an idea might have cooled since the announced TV adaptation was seemingly scrapped. Oh yeah, did I not mention they were going to make a fucking TV adaptation of this at one point? But while all of that might spell bad news for the franchise, it is worth noting that since Vampyr's launch, DontNod have confirmed that they are once again partnering with publisher Focus Home Interactive for another as yet unannounced game. So maybe Reed's story isn't over. Maybe the Doctor is yet to finish his final rounds. After all, what is death to a vampire?